welcome back to the Grand Solar Minimum channel. Today's Wednesday, November 17th, 2021. We're going to do things a little differently tonight. We haven't had a chance to comment on the COP26. It's been a week or so since it's happened. All kinds of fun and exciting things have happened. Biden took a nap. Biden broke wind. Biden broke wind again, and apparently is continuing to contribute to climate change, right? No, but seriously, a lot of things have been coming out lately about this COP26, and there was something that I'll get into here after I read you what BBC talks about climate deniers. We had a weird reckoning with COP26, the final agreement on terms of the goals for emissions. It went from phase out coal to phase down on coal, and I'll get more into that. But let's start off with what BBC is saying here. It's telling us that the grand solar minimum won't halt any warming. Here's a post from a gentleman who, or a woman could be, but they're talking about global warming is not man-made at all. It's all natural. Natural climate change, solar cycles. It goes on to talk about magnetic reversal, need to be ready, need to be prepared, adapt. And of course, the fact checker says that this is a false statement about sun cycles creating climate change and magnetic reversal. Well, I'm not going to get too much on the magnetic reversal. I don't really follow that a whole lot, but I have heard that combining this with the grand solar minimum, and we're in for a lot of trouble. So I don't turn away discussions about magnetic reversal. It's better to be prepared than not to be aware at all. So I just can't speak on when this is going to happen. And right now, a lot of people think it's going to happen during the grand solar minimum, and that would bring a lot of trouble. But it says here that thousands of posts on social media, reaching hundreds of thousands of people all over the past year, claim a grand solar minimum will lead to natural fall in temperatures without human intervention. Grand solar minimum is a real phenomenon when the sun gives off less energy as part of its natural cycle. Studies suggest that we may well go through a weaker phase sometime this century. Actually, it's right now. Thank you, BBC. But this would lead to mostly a temporary 0.1 to 0.2 cooling of the planet. Temporary, folks. That's not enough to offset the human activity, which has already warmed the planet by about 1.2 degrees Celsius over the past 200 years, and will continue to rise, possibly topping 2.4 Celsius by the end of the century. A lot of things come at me when I read this statement. First and foremost, the cooling of the grand solar minimum. We have only just begun that. And look at the UAH satellite readings here. You'll notice in 2016 we had a peak warming, and since then we have not warmed past this mark. This is the warmest that we've been in the last 30 to 50, maybe even longer than that. But for what we can see right now, satellite data, we definitely have warmed, and that peak was halted in 2016. Valentina Zarkova, who also was in Germany over the last weekend, doing a presentation on the grand solar minimum and its effects on our planet. She's also confirmed that we are in a grand solar minimum as we speak, started in 2020. Now, we saw the indication of a grand solar minimum with a double peak of solar max in solar cycle 24, which usually means when you see the double peak, a grand solar minimum is usually signaled in that double peak in the prior solar cycle. With that being said, during that double peak, we also saw temperatures peak as high as 0.7. Well, that's the adjusted temperature. It was 0.83 in February of 2016. But since then, we have seen cooling. So if you go to where we are right now, 0.37 degrees Celsius above baseline, compared to where we were from February of 2016, we're already 0.40 degrees cooler just in the last 5 years. Now, I understand that we've seen some peaks. Temperatures jumping up to 0.4. Heck, they even got back up to the 0.5 range at one point. Now we are currently sitting at 0.37. All kinds of things working in our favor, too, to possibly continue to see this cooling stay where it's at or drop even more by the end of this winter. Now we have a La Nina that's going to be affecting the northern hemisphere for its upcoming winter. We've already seen snow in China, northern China, that's already shutting things down. Russia has gotten plenty of snow already. Forecasts for a brutal winter in Europe and here in the United States are already underway, and it's still freezing in Australia, and it's almost summer. You have to couple that in with grand solar minimum. What does grand solar minimum contribute? Well, so far we've been able to correlate more volcanic activity and more seismic activity. Well, what's volcanoes got to do with it? Well, the more volcanic eruptions we have at 55,000 feet or higher, that eventually blocks out the sun and affects regional climate. And the bigger these ash plumes get, the bigger region of climate this will also affect. And we've seen tons of volcanoes. So if we're only in the very beginning of this grand solar minimum that started now and is slated to go on through the 2050s, that's about 30 years of low solar activity. These people over here at BBC want you to believe that we are only going to see a temperature drop of 0.1 to 0.2 degrees Celsius above baseline. I'm sorry, 0.1 to 0.2 degrees cooler during this 30-year period, the average anyway. So that means we've already surpassed that. We've doubled what these scientists are saying on BBC. We've doubled the cooling, and it's only year 2 of grand solar minimum. We're not even into the teeth of this grand solar minimum. Solar cycle 25 is projected to be weak or just as average as solar cycle 24 was. Solar cycle 26 is a different story. It's the beast. It's the peak of this grand solar minimum. And we've said that here at this channel. Now, a lot of folks argue that solar cycle 26 will be the beginning of grand solar minimum, but that's not true. A grand solar minimum, technically, we could probably count some of solar cycle 24. But a grand solar minimum is a period of time where we see lower than average solar activity for a few cycles consecutively. Solar cycle 24 was definitely one of the lowest cycles in over 100 years. And so far, solar cycle 25 is also on that track to be one of the weakest in 150 years plus. So what does that mean? Solar cycle 26, we get to a year or a part of this grand solar minimum where solar activity is even lower than what we just went through in 24 and 25. Sunspot numbers are going to be well below the 100. Zarkova's numbers will also prove this, and I can't wait. Mari's going to upload a couple of presentations from her and try to break things down, but Valentina is confirming again, grand solar minimum has just begun. The teeth of this is going to be here by the 2030s. So if we've already seen double the cooling now, imagine where we're going to be in the 2030s. Sure, the UHA will definitely fluctuate between now and the maximum. I'm not saying we can't see these temperatures get close to that 0.5 range, but it's unlikely that we surpass the 0.7, the 0.8 that we saw back in February of 2016. So already I call BS on BBC's claims. It says here that it's not nearly enough to offset human activity, which has already warmed the planet by 1.2 degrees Celsius over the past 200 years. Now, another thing that I want to mention, if a grand solar minimum cools around 0.2 degrees per grand solar minimum, which is about 30 years long, and let's say we're going by decade, we're cooling by somewhere just below 0.1 degrees Celsius per decade. When you look at the per decade degrees warming, that let's just give it the benefit of the doubt that this is actually human activity has caused the 1.2 above baseline temperature rise, that took 200 years. 200 years to form this 1.2 degrees. And it only took 30 years to cool 0.2. The math is not adding up, in my opinion. The rates are much faster when they acknowledge the sun's contribution, which, by the way, they're only acknowledging about maybe a third of what the impact will be on our temperatures when this grand solar minimum is said and done. So I thought it was interesting that BBC pretty much debunked themselves with their own supposed facts. You can clearly see that the rate of cooling happens a lot faster than the human behavior induced warming, if that was even a real thing. If you cool 0.2 degrees every 30 years, 60 years is 0.4, that's almost a half degree. 120 is almost a full degree. And by the time we get to around 150, 160, we're over a degree. So you got to add another 40 years on top of that, probably looking at another 0.3, 0.4. So according to their math, we should be more than 1.7 degrees above baseline than 1.2. But it clearly states that the cooling is a much faster rate than the warming. A simple guide to climate change, according to BBC. We know recent temperature rises weren't caused by the climate change in the sun's natural cycle because the layers of atmosphere near Earth is warming while the layer of atmosphere closest to the sun, the stratosphere, is cooling. They claim that heat, which would normally be released into the stratosphere, is being trapped by greenhouse gases like carbon dioxide from people burning fuel. If temperature changes on Earth were being caused by the sun, we would expect the whole atmosphere to warm or cool at the same time. That is absolutely false. Absolutely false. Your upper atmosphere is always going to be colder than anything close to the surface, okay? There's nothing in the upper atmosphere that's going to absorb sunlight or energy. So therefore, it will be impossible to see the current temperatures of surface temperatures in the atmosphere that we see on the ground. There's no science in this claim. The fact that they say that greenhouse gases is trapping the heat, that's absolutely false. It cannot trap heat past a certain height. And forgive me for not having that number, but it is definitely not trapping heat and not allowing energy to be released into the upper atmosphere. My complaint about NASA and NOAA, their weather sensors are located on runways, on highways, on rooftops, slated rooftops. And Scotland even recorded a record temperature one time, but the sensor was located in a parking lot next to an ice cream truck diesel engine that was running all day. So the fumes, the carbon from the muffler was directly facing this weather sensor, and they recorded it as a record temperature. Sure, when you look at surface temperatures that are located on the ground, CO2 does trap heat below the 4 to 5 feet range. I believe that. But once you get around the 2 meters, that's where you start to notice the temperature cooling from the ground surface. Hence, the UAH is 2 meters above surface temperatures. If NASA says we're at 1.2, which is way off of this chart, and the satellite says 2 meters from the ground, we're at 0.37, what does that tell you about CO2 and its ability to trap heat in the atmosphere? The fact that we're only going up 6 feet into the atmosphere from the ground, from the surface, and we're losing 0.8 degrees Celsius in 6 feet? The math is not adding up, folks. What they're telling you about carbon is incorrect and not true whatsoever. There's no denying climate change. It's happening. The sun is causing this climate change. Claim, global warming is good. It is good. In fact, CO2 is so good that there will be a paper that will prove it soon that human lifespan has increased with the CO2 levels. In other words, it's no coincidence that our population is 7 billion higher than it was in 1850. We've also seen a rise in CO2. CO2 appears to not just give plants life, but us humans as well. Lifespans, look it up. They're much, much longer than what they were in 1850, right? But it says here, various posts circulating online claim global warming will make parts of the Earth more habitable, that cold kills more people than heat does. These arguments often cherry-pick favorable facts while ignoring any that contradict them. Kind of sounds like what you're doing, BBC. Kind of sounds like the AGW. They make claims about grand solar minimum only cooling 0.2 degrees in a 3-decade period, but they don't show the proof. They don't show the proof during the Maunder minimum, do they? Then they tell you that the Earth will warm to 2.4 degrees Celsius above baseline by the end of 2100. Valentina Zarkova also claims that we will see warming after this grand solar minimum. Solar inertia motion. That's how we get the warming. The cooling comes from these grand cycles. These solar minimums kind of give the sun a break, cools the planet down a little bit, and then as it continues its orbit around for the next few cycles, it will get warm again, just like it will cool again. Heat, which would normally be released, and we already read that part. They're upset because they say that global warming is good. Now they're trying to tell you that it's bad. It says here, but in the same places, warming could also lead to extreme rainfall, affecting living conditions and the ability to grow crops. That, folks, is true, but they're forgetting the key ingredient of cosmic rays. Cosmic radiation dosage rates are high right now, 8.5% as we speak. We just had a big solar storm a couple weeks ago that dropped it all the way down to 1.6% dosage rate. You would think, well, okay, we're finally starting to see cosmic rays disappear because we're heading towards the max. Wrong again. That solar storm just kind of brushed the cosmic rays away for temporarily. Once that solar wind died down, cosmic radiation dosage rates have jumped all the way up as high as 8.8% just in the last couple of days. Then they go on to talk about how we face climate extinction, at risk nations say, blah, blah, blah. They want to talk about how many people died as a result of cold weather than hot. Look, I don't know. And then they also put in the obvious, the claim climate change action will make people poor. Okay. I was going to show you an article. I'll do it another time. That talks about Germany's natural gas and how the cost have skyrocketed. These countries that were at the COP26 are making pledges that they can't keep. In fact, today or yesterday, I saw a report that the oil production has now increased. It had decreased because I think the world was set to start these climate change initiatives. But at the end of the COP26, India, the big boy, said it was not going to join their party because they used the words phase out coal. After a long meeting, the other 199 nations finally said, okay, India, your one view on this will be the view. Now, how is it that India was able to sway 199 nations to say phase out coal to phase it down? Which means, yes, they're still going to reduce the amount of coal, but now they're not talking about getting rid of it. Somebody finally talk some sense into those folks and let them know that these next few decades, during the grand solar minimum, we will see record cold. We will see a higher demand for heat supply and energy supply, and solar and wind will simply not be able to keep up, and yes, it will make people poor. The Green New Deal is another example. The post up at the beginning of this article claims that climate change initiatives will make people poorer and the rich will get richer. And I've been saying this for a long time. Yes, they might have even stole this post from me. Who knows? This could be one of my tweets. Not global warming. It's all natural climate change, not man-made at all. That was to get the rich more money, and it did. What are you talking about, Jake? Well, Al Gore and all these other people, Jeff Bezos and all these other billionaires and millionaires out there invested in companies like Impossible Meats, Incognito Meat, the chicken. We also have several other green new ways to save the planet that all these millionaires and billionaires invested in. And gee, the government's trying to make these climate initiatives law. And who would benefit from such a thing? That's right, those millionaires and billionaires that invested in these climate change initiatives. And that's why they care so much about the stock market. Watching these stocks rise, not caring about the economy, and not caring about the fact that you have to pay more money for your food, you have to pay more money for your gas, you're going to pay more money for your heating bills this winter. I've already gotten an email from National Grid telling me expect a $36 to $56 increase a month. Not from my use, from the price of natural gas. So yes, these green new policies that are phasing down, I should say, not phasing out, but phasing down of fossil fuels, part of that phasing down is penalizing the people by raising the costs. It's the embarrassment of a nation that's trying to go green and then realizes they can't heat their residence in the wintertime, so they have to shamefully flip back the coal switch on. But we're going to make you pay because this is all your fault in the first place. It's cooling because of global warming. You've heard that one too. So I just think it's a joke that the BBC is trying to call us climate deniers by simply just making the claim and not showing you how supposedly CO2 traps heat. The claim renewable energy is dangerously unreliable. Misleading posts claim renewable energy failures led to the blackouts that went viral this year. Electricity grid failure in Texas. No. Sensationalists made a big deal about that. Only 20% of Texas's power comes from renewables, and that's probably heavy. That's probably a closer number of 10%. Had nothing to do with the windmills. Texas is not prepared for single-digit temperatures. Point blank. They're not ready for that. They don't get that. They don't usually see that kind of cold. Natural gas demand in the wintertime is lower in Texas than it is in Ohio. So this wasn't about the wind failing us or the solar panels failing us. This was about a state that got some record cold, and residents who usually don't use this much energy, all of a sudden a price hike, a spike was up, and they barely kept the grid on. I mean, they were so close to having rolling blackouts because of the demand. So nobody's ever claimed, now I shouldn't say nobody, because there are people that blame the windmills for this, but the realist, the logical people like us, we didn't make that claim. This was all about demand, and Texas wasn't ready. You say, Jake, well, Texas, don't they insulate their homes to keep the air conditioner in? I'm sure they do. But to keep in the colder air, to block out the heat temperatures from the outside is a little different than how it works from keeping an inside of a house warm. I'm sure they insulate, but it's probably not as thick as it should be when you're talking about the temperatures that Texas saw last year that killed people. Frozen turbines were not the blame for the rollouts. That's true. But do you really think that solar and wind are going to be enough to help Texas? Let's pretend that we didn't have natural gas. Let's pretend we didn't have coal. Do you guys really believe that we would have seen Texas residents warm and safe because of all their solar and wind? Turbines would have been frozen. Yeah, then we would have seen the blackouts. But it was just a plain preparation situation in Texas. So what frustrates me the most is, we keep getting slandered by being called climate deniers. Anyone who follows Grand Solar Minimum knows that Grand Solar Minimum is a natural cycle that happens once in 2 lifetimes, and we happen to be alive to witness this. Now, hopefully most of you are my age or younger, so at the end of this, we can do a touchdown dance and spike the football right in the AGW's face and say, I told you, and that this battle for our kids' future is very futile. Why? Because right now, Brandon wants to raise taxes and energy prices and hand the burden off to your children and your grandchildren. You think things are rough now. let this Green New Deal stuff pass. Your kids will not understand how its parents' generation left them with such a crazy debt and a crazy crisis when it all started with a bunch of nonsense of global warming and man causing climate change. So, BBC, you're full of it. And I want to show you this too. Article posted about the COP26, why it was a flop, what went wrong. Is this the one that we had on Tall Bloke? So the real reasons for COP26 flop. Only alarmists could be impressed by an alarmist echo chamber, and even that didn't work on the streets. Protesters, as CCD puts it, what kind of a conference is this that only invites people with one viewpoint? That's a great question. What kind of a conference? That's like preaching to the choir, right? Like if we were just on Rumble, well, duh, all of us want to hear what we got to say, but we want our message to be played on mainstream as well so people can learn something about climate science. They think Bill Nye and Greta have the answers. That's wrong. King coal is dead. Long live King coal. That was basically what India did to the COP26. That might be what happened and how it ended on Friday. They went in there with this, we're going to kill coal. And at the end, it was like, well, we're not going to kill it yet. It culminated with an agreement which had not so much been watered down as to have virtually evaporated, folks. Fossil fuels, it seems, are here for the foreseeable future. What went wrong? The question deeply frustrated COP26 President Alok Sharma might well be asking himself. He appeared to close to tears at the announcement of negotiations pushed to emotional extremes by the last-minute wrangling over a single word. Should we commit ourselves to phase out the use of coal or phase down the use of coal? The distress of no drama, Sharma. It was phased down that won the day, thanks to hardball negotiating from India, China, South Africa, and Iran. Folks, I'm here to tell you those four nations are the biggest polluting nations in the world when it comes to manufacturing. We shouldn't perhaps be surprised by this outcome. It's hard not to be cynical about a conference that claimed to be saving the earth, but ended up just costing the earth. Yeah, costing means all the fossil fuels they had to burn in their private jets to get them there. All the fossil fuels they had to fuel up those Mercedes diesel engine cars that transported these world leaders around for a few days. We had Joe Biden falling asleep, Prince Charles stumbling, Greta outside oddly joining a chorus of climate skeptics for a rousing sing-along, "Stop the blah, blah, blah." That's what she was chanting. Stop the blah, blah, blah. That's what we say too, Greta. We had Barack Obama believing he was somewhere called the Emerald Isles, and CNN believing the conference was taking place in Edinburgh. Okay. Then to cap it off, there was the alleged minor emissions leak. Biden, apparently he passed gas and then did it again. Also pooped his pants, I guess, too. I don't know. More methane. And then the museum in the presence of a royal... Wow, so he did it in front of royalty. COP26 combined level of decadence with the Soviet Union level of self-serving hypocrisy. The global elite jetted in, kept well clear of the... I don't know what Roger's saying here. Delivered speeches.
He's a Brit, so holy-poly.
Holy-poly. Delivered speeches indiscussable in content.
I don't know.
Only in fever. Then flew out again, leaving vapor trails of noxious gases in their wake. The expense, both financially and in terms of emissions was extraordinary. According to the Daily Record, the private jets alone spewed out more CO2 than 1,600 Scots produce in 1 year. Where can the intergovernment environment movement go from here? Well, thank you very much, Roger, for that. Aside from me not totally understanding your language.
It's the common people, the masses.
Okay.
Poi.
So with that being said, we have seen a huge defeat in the phase out coal plan. And now it's called phasing down. 4 nations against 199 were able to convince the 199 to not phase out coal, but to phase it down. Just take it down a notch. China, India, also 2 of the biggest continents on the planet Earth, also the biggest carbon tax spenders. So remember, folks, to the IPCC and the UN, if you're spending those carbon tax credits, you're okay in our books because the rich are getting richer, folks. That's what this all is about, wealth distribution. This Green New Deal is not about saving the planet, but changing the economy and saving the rich. Meanwhile, people like me and you have to figure out ways to pay our bills this winter when heating bills are going to be through the roof here in the United States. We've been reading about it all over the world. We're getting ready to witness it ourselves. Natural gas is up, coal is up, oil is up. And the funny part is that right before they're trying to pass the social part of this infrastructure bill, the climate change stuff, they all of a sudden start to boost production of oil. It's increasing now because it's going to be winter here in the Northern Hemisphere, colder weather, higher energy demand. It's logic, folks. We are not at the capacity yet to just ditch fossil fuels like that and go green all the way 100%. You show me a reliable solar panel system, I'll go for it, 100%. But to say we could do it right now is absolute nonsense. To say we'll be zero emissions by 2030 is absolute garbage. What are you going to do when your electric car battery needs to be replaced? Not the 12-volt battery, the actual electric battery that runs the system. You're looking at between $6,000 and $10,000.
France has a graveyard of cars.
So I don't think that we are in a position right now to tell people you have to buy an electric car and, get ready for that $10,000 expense that's coming in about 6 or 7 years. Can't trade the car in. Nobody's going to want to buy a used electric vehicle when they know the electric battery is probably going to go out in 2 years. Again, folks, the Green New Deal is starting to lose its momentum. And it started at the COP26 with all the, Boris fell asleep. Prince Charles sounded weird. Joe Biden passed gas twice and fell asleep. And meanwhile, you had Greta outside talking about stop the blah, blah, blah. Stop the blah, blah, blah. Because she's out there taunting. Now, here's the best part about this. She's taunting the world leaders. You're not going to do anything about climate change. You're just going to sit there and just do nothing. And guess what? Greta was finally right about something. They sat in that conference and accomplished nothing. They changed the verbiage from phasing out to phasing down. So you decide for yourself, folks, who's telling you the truth? The people who bring you scientific papers that shows the proof on climate change and how it's natural, or the people who bring you actors like Bill Nye and Greta and Al Gore and just make claims about CO2 trapping heat? Guys, take this all in. You decide for yourself.